Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Founder's Journey podcast. And this week we've got Hassan Chaudhury. Um, I'm literally not going to encroach on your bio at all because I think that'll probably take up most of the hour. I think that one's been done to death. We've had some Mickey taken on the LinkedIn post around your the length of your bio as well. But suffice to say, successful founder, government advisor, advisor to numerous startups, and definite connector of dots through your latest venture you co-founded, helping people bridge gaps everywhere and connecting people who are doing really cool stuff in healthcare with each other to make stuff more impactful. I think that's probably the shortest way I can condense your bio. And welcome, Hassan. It's good to see you again.
No, thank you so much, Chris. And I've really enjoyed the podcast so far and the journeys that you've been going through. One day I'd love to hear more about you, but we'll talk about that another time.
Me as a podcast guest. Yeah. Fantastic. I guess one place I always like to start is about what makes you you. What was the early part of your life like, Hassan? What's your origin story? They seem to be popular.
So I am what you'd call a late bloomer. I was somebody that should have studied harder, really should have. I mean, my mother still regards me to be a little bit of a disappointment because I didn't become a doctor, which is a very immigrant way of looking at it, right? So I'm second generation. Although I do feel I have a reason. And the reason is if you are the child of immigrant parents, then the pressure that is put on you to succeed, because they want to live through you, they want to live vicariously through your success. So the easiest way you can succeed is to become something big like a doctor. And I think I recoiled and rebounded away from that pressure. And I ended up so laid back, I was horizontal. That's really what the first part of my life and my career really was. So when people ask me, oh, so you're in tech, you're in medical, AI, you're in all these areas, drug discovery and drug development, what did you do at university? And I say, I have a BA honors in politics. And not to be disrespectful to the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's now passed away, but I'd often say that I got a Desmond, which if you're of a certain age, you'll know means I got a Tutu.
A tutu.
Yeah, because I didn't study that hard. And I ended up with my wife saying to me she's pregnant. And that's when it clicked that I need a career. That's genuinely my origin story. Up to the age of about 28, I was not much to write home about. That's the truth, right? And I was motivated by something that's quite unusual, which comes under the underrepresented founder bit, which is that as a Muslim, I can't take interest, which means I can't get a conventional mortgage.
Yeah.
Which means living in London, I can't buy a house unless I have a ridiculous amount of money to put down on a deposit. So the reason I got into business was because I wanted to impress my mother, who thought I was a bit of a disappointment because I hadn't been a doctor. And I can't take an interest-based mortgage. So I need to become an entrepreneur. Now, this is the most ridiculous reason I've heard yet. And I've asked lots of people about their origin stories. And the fact you've got this out of me on camera speaks to how well I like you, really. So here I am, and I've done lots of weird and wonderful things. For example, I was a social worker, but that's a protected title. You can't be a social worker unless you have the qualification. But I was used somewhat illegally, and I won't mention by which organization, which London borough did this, but I was used somewhat illegally as a social worker for the elderly for a number of years. And that's where I saw people in need. I saw the breakdown between health and care. I was co-located in a GP surgery. They called it Murder Mile, which might give it away, but it's because there was a lot of knife and gun crime, more than Soweto, actually, in that one bit of Murder Mile. in London. So that was my origin story, where I remember I went to do a visit at someone's home, and this gentleman who was in his 70s, 80s, dementia, he had incontinence pads, so nappies,
Mm-hmm.
and no one had removed them from his home. So he had bin bags full of them, and they were all over the home. And his domestic worker, who was a very strong, tough Nigerian woman, said, "Don't go in there," and then walked away. And as she walked away, she said something about fleas. And I knew that I had to go in, because if I didn't do an assessment and help this gentleman maybe get into residential or nursing, it was actually residential, then something would happen to him, because he didn't know what he was doing, and he'd leave, and sometimes his pants would fall down and he'd go out in the street. And that's the kind of thing I did at the very beginning of my career. There was a stint in the civil service, and then I asked a friend of mine, when my wife said she was pregnant, I asked him, I need a career. What do you think I should do? He said, "Why don't you join us at Bart's? We're doing a Cerner rollout, an electronic patient record rollout." And at the time, I didn't know what he was talking about.
Mm.
He said, "Don't worry, just turn up."
Yeah.
And I turned up, and the lady who interviewed me said, "This isn't an interview. I just want you to know what you're doing when you start tomorrow." So now,
Hey,
so,
presto, new career as something. Yeah.
so now I'm in clinical informatics, right? I'm at Bart's at the Royal London, and British Telecom, BT as it was, uh, they were rolling out effectively the nerve center of the hospital, where all the information goes, right? Electronic patient records, EPRs, are important all over the world. They are the one that makes sure that the hospital can think, if you like, because all the information is in a certain place. And the rollout had gone wrong. It had gone so badly wrong because they'd lost something called the clock start. So very briefly, Tony Blair's government made a promise that for most conditions, you would get from referral to treatment in 18 weeks.
Mhm.
The problem was we'd lost the beginning of the clock. So we were discharging everybody at 17 weeks and 6 days.
Oh.
And NHS London said to us, "Do you think we're stupid? Do you think discharging everyone at 17 weeks and 6 days, you'd get away with it? We're going to fine you." So I was part of a team that was trying to save the data and trying to work out where all the pathways were. So I was thrown in at the deep end and taught every clinical pathway.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of my education in clinical informatics. I'd moved from social work, where I wasn't a social worker, into clinical informatics, where I'm not a clinician. I'll pause there, Chris, just to give you an idea of how ridiculous that sounds.
It's that's an amazing transformation in a very short space of time as well. I guess that's the key. And that piece you spoke about earlier as well, about being of immigrant parents and that move into a respectable career, obviously resonates with Nick Panari as well, who'd been on a previous week, because exactly the same thing, and found that he was frustrated there. Whereas I guess you didn't have time to be frustrated. You may have been bearing those frustrations on that journey through, but had no real time to stop to become frustrated enough at that stage. But is this where you then start to identify the shortcomings and potential better outcomes, or was that further down the line?
Further down the line, because I'll remind you, my wife is pregnant. So I'm facing a crisis at Bart's because we're going to get fined £400,000 a week. I'm trying to learn the difference between different parts of rheumatology from scratch,
Wow.
on a system which, to be honest, at the time felt a bit like we'd been sold a retail system that had kind of been crowbarred into healthcare. So at the time, I remember most of the staff were able to talk to each other and type in, booking, without needing a mouse, without using a GUI, a graphical user interface, because
Yeah.
they knew the shortcuts. So then they were taught that they had to use a mouse and a keyboard, and they had to click on screens and move across. And the way it worked was where you exited a screen was different on each page.
Oh,
So people got very, very lost. It was a very difficult rollout. So those are the kind of things I was dealing with. And I left soon after. I was poached by an organization that commissions healthcare. So in the UK, we have a split between the part that delivers, that provides, and the part that buys or commissions. So I moved from the provider to the commissioner to Waltham Forest. And Waltham Forest asked me to become an 18-week analyst. I became the first 18-week analyst in the country. And I've got to admit, I cheated. I was asked to build a system, and I realized that this report would always come in Excel in the
yeah.
same format, where the figures I wanted were always in the same cells. So then I made a query that would just pull from those cells. I would just have to change the name of the file. Then I'd go make a cup of tea. And everyone thought that I'd done something really cool. And I was there thinking, I've built something that's really horrible. I wish I was better at coding. And that's what my job was when I was at Waltham Forest. And then another organization came along and asked us to look at a system, and I was the one that was managing the numbers. So I could say what our contract value was with a hospital, what they call plan versus actual. This is what you're supposed to be, and this is what you actually have spent. So if it's a £12 million contract and you're midway, it should be 6 million. But unfortunately, you've spent seven. So can you see your plan versus actual is a bit of a problem?
Yeah.
And they had a £20 million error.
Wow.
So when I exposed the error, they then poached me to join that team. So then I moved. It's a long story,
You
but
play it down, but there's a consistent theme of problem identification and solution there.
you're dead right. It's because I didn't have a heritage or a background to confuse me. Every single time I came to a problem, I was fresh to it. And I looked at it with fresh eyes, and I would say, well, this feels like this answer. And having explored it, everyone said, yeah, that's fine. And I did it, and it worked. And then I realized a lot of the problems we have in the NHS are because we have old thinking. This is how it's always been done. And one of the reasons why that is because we've got really smart people in the NHS is because there's no time to think. There's too much to do. We talk about clinical burnout. We actually have non-clinical burnout. Everyone is burnt out. There's just too much going on.
Well, the
And
pressure does start from, as you say, the commissioning area, which, and if it starts there, then that just loads further pressure further down as well, the delivery arm. So, yeah, absolutely, I get that.
yeah, it's bad because we still are fundamentally undisrupted. So this idea that you have a consultant doing a ward round actually comes from a previous century where consultants were not attached to the hospital. They would visit to consult. That's why you had them from a limited period. So that's why you do a ward round and everyone would follow them around. And we've just continued it because that's how it's always been. That's the kind of disruption that's required in healthcare. We should begin again, but you can't. It's a bit like having a plane that you need to fix while it's in the air. And that really is the challenge for the NHS. We can't pause. That's the problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Especially with the scrutiny and political visibility and pressures, depending on whoever's in governance at the time as well. So, and their agendas. So, yeah, that must be huge pressure even at that level, I
And
guess.
because I've left government, I can say this. It's clear that Labour doesn't want to make any commitment right now. It needs to get closer to a potential election before it makes any policy agreements. So right now, there's no discussion on policy, and we're still going to just muddle through a horrible winter. We're still going to muddle through with lots and lots of junior doctors unhappy with the way that they're paid and they're managed. These things will just continue until there's a general election that focuses the mind. So the NHS as a political football is a real problem.
I'm hearing this from friends within the NHS as well. There are divides being created by the fast tracking of junior doctors through that qualification period and into full practice. And nurses being trained up to the extent that they're almost doing the junior doctors' jobs and having to cover for that. So there's there's the potential there that we could get the brain drain and people drain accelerated before, as you say, that there is any change in governance in the country. So, and
And
how do you deal with the external perception as well? I mean, you were, I guess, almost lucky in a way than being an outsider that's come inside with those fresh eyes. A lot of people that look from the outside into breaking into health tech often have the similar view that it's, well, I'm going to go to the US or I'm going to go somewhere else where there's private care to actually go and get this implemented because they'll recognize the value of the solution quicker than actually trying to go through the health body in my own countries. Do you think that marries up with some of the problems you faced as well from inside the organization?
I'd say that the difficulty with choosing a market to go for is often that they're driven by different things. So I remember speaking to colleagues in the US who said to me, it's a mistake to say you save money. And I asked them why. And they said, because this system is about making money. So if you're saving money, someone is losing money. Who is the one that's losing money? And if you see that there's a group that loses money for your innovation, they will block you. They will make it harder for your innovation because you cost them cash. Whereas in a public health system that has universal healthcare, free at the point of care in the NHS, trying to save time feels like the right thing to do, but it isn't, for the simple reason that just because you've saved 5 minutes for a nurse doesn't mean that you can now take away the cost of the nurse. The nurse is just going to use those 5 minutes somewhere else. It's a bit like creating more road, more lanes, more cars will appear. So how is it that you're able to work within the constraints and the motivations of that system requires you to have a deep understanding of what they're driven by. And that's the real danger. I understood very quickly, actually, in the NHS that the commissioner needed to keep the provider alive. It wasn't in the interests of the commissioner to push down and say, well, no, we're not going to pay you. Because if they did, and one of those hospitals didn't have enough cash, they would just close down those beds or close down the service, and no one would win. So therefore, it was the commissioner as an invisible hand trying to keep the economy going. And if you can see how that's how the system works, then you'll realize actually the problem for most health tech and digital health founders is that they don't realize the wider game. They think it's just about getting their innovation in. It's not about how everyone wins. And the people that do the best in a high context environment, they realize everybody has to win.
Huge stakes. Huge stakes. Um, so you start to identify the problems. You've been poached twice. So what was the next step from there?
Well, I'll try and skip a tiny bit in the next 3 years,
Okay.
but I think I had in those 3 years I had multiple roles, but sometimes the same organization just changing its name because there was a lot of flux that was going on at the time. And I worked in clinical informatics and public health until Andrew Lansley wanted to make a top-down reorganization of the NHS. And that reorganization of the NHS led to many of us in analytics thinking we need to leave. So two friends of mine said, we need to leave now and form our own consultancy and provide that help back to the NHS. The alternative was to work in what they called sector acute commissioning units. And the acronym is unfortunate because it spells SACU. And that's
Just
really,
thinking.
I'm not making it up. That's really what they were called. And a lot of analysts said, forget this. And they went to Qatar. They went to the Middle East. They went to fintech. They went to other industries. We had a brain drain. We lost lots of analytical organizational memory around that time because the organizations that used to look after them were all being disbanded and reformed. So me and those two friends we formed a company called Health IQ.
Mm-hmm.
And the name has meaning, although whenever we explained it to people, it would take ages for them to get it. But the point is, data becomes information when you add context.
Yeah.
And then when you can make a decision on it, it becomes intelligence, which is why we're called Health IQ. No one got it immediately. So we went out to market and realized we were too early to help the NHS because they were in the flux, the change of what they were doing. We went to one organization who said, you can sit in at the beginning of the board meeting and then you can present. And the beginning of the board meeting was trying to work out their logo. And that's when we realized we'd quit our jobs a bit early because a lot of the advice I give companies, Chris, is based upon my own mistakes. And I'd like to think the reason why I'm doing okay is because I made so many mistakes. I made every mistake you can think of. I've pivoted repeatedly. And I tell you, with respect to the two founders who are with me, who are good friends to this day, that I think in many ways they gave me a leg up. They were more experienced than I was. And I was a minority founder of the shareholding.
Uh-huh.
And they're both absolutely brilliant people. And without them, I would have died a million times over. It would have been one of those. I don't know if you watched the film Groundhog Day.
Uh-huh.
At the end of every day, you repeat. I would have just died each time, every single day, because business is hard, right?
Yeah.
It is really, really hard. What we realized was we built a product that no one wanted or would ever want. So we consulted, because we had to keep the lights on. We consulted for 2 to 3 years with pharma. And when we consulted for those years, we then learned what to do and built a product and a product suite that then meant we became very clear about our product portfolio. And then we went for about 9 years and we were acquired in 2019. So from 2011 to 2019, I was the chief commercial officer. And before that, the CIO at Health IQ. We were what they call a real world evidence company. Real world evidence is all the data outside of clinical trials. Mm-hmm. So if you want to work out how many bariatric surgeries there are in Wales last year, that's a real world evidence question. What happened in real life? And that's important because no one trusts clinical trials. Mm-hmm. There's been so many mistakes made by industry about clinical trials. For example, you've done 12 trials, 3 of them killed somebody. Let's just delete those 3 so no one knows about them. That's what used to happen in the old days.
Wow.
So real world evidence was then anyway, a complement to the clinical data. And the UK is very different. The UK is still a gold standard, but there's a lot of bad places around the world where people were playing around. So we formed a real world evidence company. We served half of the top 100 global life science firms. And when we were acquired, I decided not to do the earnout. So most people would say, you're crazy. That's what you sell the company for. But I told my 2 co-founders that I think I'm ready for something new. Mm-hmm. So I stepped out. But I was, in many ways, the face of the company. Even though I would say the other 2 guys were instrumental in what we did, I was the one people knew. So the buying company was a bit miffed. So they asked for a 3-year non-compete. And I jumped at it. I signed that before the ink wasn't dry, I think, from the printer. I signed it because for me, a 3-year sprint after a 9-year marathon just wasn't what I wanted to do. And I was quite happy to step away from real world evidence. And somehow a friend of mine said, oh, why don't you join me in what I do? And I said, so what do you do? And he said, you see a theme here. And he said, I work at the Department for International Trade and I'm a specialist. I said, okay, so what does that mean? And to this day, I'm still not sure. I mean, I've left the role last year.
I did specialist something.
What a specialist is meant to be is you own an area because the civil servants are generalists.
Yeah.
So they need someone with commercial industry background who knows everybody, who knows the landscape, can guide them and have commercial conversations. That's really what a specialist does, right? So the organization we were in was healthcare life sciences. And I was asked to be the specialist in digital health. And no word of a lie, I went on Wikipedia because I needed to just to make sure. And the definition of digital health doesn't make sense. There's more than 40 of them. I reviewed the definitions of digital health. Digital health is an umbrella term that covers different technologies, digital data, AI, all of those, right? Remote patient wearables, like a Fitbit, all of those things and how they touch healthcare. That's the definition. It's just a laundry list of lots of technologies. So I wondered, so am I trying to work out the technology or the use case? And they said, no, you're trying to work out the supply chain. So I remember speaking to a commercial officer in Singapore in the British Embassy. Her name was Valsa. And Valsa asked me a question that taught me my job. The question was, do you know a British company in immersive technology, so augmented reality, virtual reality, for surgical training that wants Singapore? And I thought to myself, well, even if I knew all of the good companies in the UK that are interested in export, that are in the space, how do I know they want Singapore? And that's when I realized my job was to understand the supply chain well enough that I could matchmake. And I was effectively, for 4 years, a paid concierge between the UK's supply chain in digital health and the world's buyers. And I was sent out by UK government to 96 countries, which is really anywhere we had a consulate, where there's a commercial team, and I would support the commercial team to make those deals. But I was also the person for inward. So if you were a Swiss company, Swiss embassy in London, Charlotte would send an email and say, I've got a company for you. So I was the one on the hook to try to help them get into the UK and sell the UK rather than choose us, not France, or choose us, not the US. So my job was inward and outward, 96 countries, part-time.
Wow. So it's a bit of a deep end, without any rubber rings.
Yeah, there was no rubber there.
So how the hell did you manage that? I mean, did you end up having to build something out from scratch? Was it just you? Or
I tell you what happened, right? I was sent to lots of conferences around the world. And people kept asking me, so Dr. Hassan, what do you think? And I'd say, I'm not a doctor. And the Malaysians to this day still don't believe me. Like, how is the UK government sending you to us and you don't have a clinical background? And I'm not going to be able to show them my tutu. Like, what? I can't say to the Malaysians, thank you for making me your international keynote for your annual conference on digital health. And I've just got a tutu from Queen Mary in politics. That's what I was, right? It's because I understood with fresh eyes that digital health cannot be a laundry list of technologies.
Yeah.
So actually, I'm working on a new definition of digital health. And I think this might be the first time I'm ever going to say it out loud. I think it's the reimagining of the healthcare use case and leveraging what we get from the industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, which is data, digital AI. But it's use case based. It's not based on the technology. In fact, in many ways, we couldn't care less what the technology is. Does it matter that's QR code? Does it matter that I'm using robotic process automation or generative AI? And by the way, there's an argument now that generative AI is about to kill robotic process automation. There's lots of these conversations, right? And RPA, which is really little bots doing lots of tasks in sequence, is too brittle for it to be holding big gaps in enterprise software, which the EPR, the electronic patient record, is meant to fill that gap. But when you have big gaps, RPA is too brittle. And generative AI can just pull data from things because you've asked it to. So can you see does it matter which of those two you use? In many ways, as long as it's for the healthcare use case, it's digital health. And that's why now when you book an appointment at a hospital and you use your mobile phone, you would expect what you've just asked for, a 12 o'clock appointment to be straight in to the database. What used to happen, and this is actually the same thing that happened with BA and flights, what you would do on your web app would send an email, and a human being would then have to type that into a machine. What you had was a wrapper, which didn't mean any real connection between the two. So what we expect is frictionless, immediate. That's what we expect from digital on everything that we do, on retail, on fintech.
Mhm.
That's why we like Monzo, right? That's why we like the challenger banks. Healthcare doesn't have that. Healthcare is a series of fake, bogus wrappers where you think it's digital and it's really 100 people, mechanical Turk, working behind the scenes. And two examples. One is if you see a nurse going to a blood gas machine, the machine's too large. It's one big machine. There's not one on each bedside. So walking over to the machine and then writing on a post-it note and then walking to another machine to type it in. Now, that is the reality of healthcare. That to me is horrendous, especially with the transcription error. Imagine that you type that in wrong. To give you another idea, there's a company called Becton Dickinson, BD, and they have a product called Guardrails. And Guardrails means when you're putting in an IV infusion, maybe morphine drip, and you put in 10.2, but you fail to press the decimal point hard enough, and you put 102, right? You could kill the patient, right?
Yeah.
And that happens, that genuinely happens. So Guardrails is commercial software that means that you can set a hard limit and a soft limit. A soft limit can be overridden by the healthcare professional, and a hard limit can never be overridden. But for us to have to put those things in tells you how manual the processes are. Paramedics writing with a bic on a glove. That's how manual we are in so many parts of healthcare.
I've seen it firsthand. So yeah, these that's not anecdotal, and I wouldn't expect you with your data background to accept something that anecdotal either. But um, that's huge. And obviously, you've gone from being a founder where you can afford almost to make those mistakes, and as you say, you could have died every day if it was Groundhog Day. Um, and for what it's worth, I think every founder that listens to this or listens to your story will definitely resonate with that. And I guess the key bit about that is don't beat yourself up over it. It's okay to make mistakes in that environment as a startup founder, because unless you make those mistakes, you don't learn, and you learn what your users want. People tend not to realize, if they haven't been close to Magic Source itself, that in total, in essence, that's been 3+ years in the making from that inception, that thought, and then trialing this and trialing that, and using this business model, using that technology. So I think most people could resonate with that. And then moving into this environment with that spotlight as well is a hell of a change when working for government, because I guess those mistakes just aren't acceptable again because of that scrutiny. So how is that changing again from that it's okay to make mistakes environment into one where, you know, you screw up with something and that's going to cost UK PLC tens of millions of pounds, or another country tens of millions of pounds, and a hit reputation for UK tech. I mean, that's a lot of responsibility for probably less of an outcome. So
You're so right. So I went from being a bootstrap founder. I should have mentioned I didn't take any investment. Friends and family. We had, between the three of us, 99% of the company at sale because we shaved 1% off, so we could give it to the sales director, so that we could protect her on the way into the sale, because she had like £1 million of revenue.
yeah,
Right? So for us to have bootstrapped, that level of freedom is not It's not common, right? Most people will have an investor, a chairperson, a board observer, someone saying, why aren't you doing this, right? To go from that to the point where the embassy's relationship with that country outlives us all. So if we make a mistake, it's the embassy's relationship that gets burnt. It's not really about whether the vendor, whether the innovator is burnt. They can rebound. It's about whether the UK's relationship with that country works. So I remember the Singaporean Ministry of Health being quite upset with the British Embassy in Singapore because that innovator who was meant to join a call had childcare issues and missed the call and stood up the Singaporean Ministry of Health. Now imagine that you're on a call, you're the British Embassy, Singapore, and you've bought the Singaporean Ministry of Health on the call and you're waiting. That's where the real responsibility is. I remember one company, they were introduced by the British Embassy in Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. Then they cut the British Embassy out of the email chain and continued the conversation, not realizing the faux pas, not realizing that the Kuwaitis saw that as an insult. You've insulted our friends.
Mm.
And the Kuwaitis are really Anglophile.
Yeah.
Genuinely, there's a real close relationship there. So what happens in Kuwait is you will never win a deal if the British Embassy doesn't vouch for you. The British Embassy, even if they didn't introduce you, will be asked, do you know this company? And a lot of the time I would be asked, have you heard of this company? They've tried to get into this market. And I would say, sorry, I've never heard of them before.
And that will be it.
Well, we'd always want to try and understand what they've achieved. You know, it's very, very possible in digital health that I just didn't know the company. But the good thing about what I'd managed to achieve for the UK government was that I built something called the playbook, the export playbook. If you remember back to the story I gave you about Valsa, I then kept records of all the companies that I thought were good and which markets they wanted and which markets they didn't want. Or which, so for example, some said English speaking only. And by the way, that often meant that they were talking about the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but not talking about Ireland and South Africa. They hadn't thought about it. I remember one company saying, we've got a problem with time zones. You know, we need clinicians who are English speaking, but we just don't know where to get them because I said, so sorry, let me just remind you that South Africa exists, you know. But some people would just say this is the market they wanted. That turned into a resource that I asked the UK government to publish. And I got resistance for many months. And eventually I was given approval because NHS Digital, the chairperson of NHS Digital, stepped in and said, are you who was very close to us because the chairperson of NHS Digital was also the chairperson of Healthcare UK at Department of International Trade because we were funded by NHS England.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no, this is a great idea. What's wrong with you? So we put something together called the first 100 because I wasn't allowed to call it the top 100. And it was the first 100 companies for export. And the playbook, which is a resource that's available online and in PDF, profiles all of those companies, what they do, what their website is, which markets they're in, which markets they want. And the companies that got into it had a badge they could put on their website and their email saying, we're part of the first 100 from Healthcare UK. And all the embassies around the world, I trained all the embassy teams and different time zones on which companies to go for. So if you're asked question A, go for this company. If you're asked question B. And as I did so, I broke down what you might call the categorization of digital health into 10 areas. And I was later told by the Irish, by effectively their transformation directorate for Ireland, Professor Martin Curley, he said, this hasn't been done before anywhere, breaking down digital health into use cases. So I'll tell you them briefly. The first one is self-care. How do you look after yourself and how do we give you tech for that? The second is how do we triage you? Because when you're coming in, we need to prioritize. The third is if only we'd been doing screening long-term, we would have caught this if we'd done long-term diagnostics. Number 4, how do we do virtual care? Number 5, we've got a lot of data now. What do we do with it? You know, it was tongue in cheek, but it's really the flow of how you manage your technology.
The life cycle of, yeah.
Absolutely. And then we put all the companies under those zones. And then we said, here you are. So I remember Mexico asking me, do you have a company that can do this? We've heard of Babylon. And many of the people listening will know about Babylon's collapse,
Yeah.
which is a real shame because their growth really did make the market. And the Mexicans wanted Babylon. And I asked them, but what do you want to achieve? And they said, we need a really rugged system that will help us in rural healthcare to do video calls and teleconferencing where clinician to clinician, what we call telemedicine. And I said, well, that's not Babylon. Babylon is very much around a really smooth and wonderful experience in primary care, but it's not consultant to consultant, and it's not rugged. It's not the thing that you put in those places. It's more high end, really easy to use, really joyful to use, and they just weren't aware because they just heard of Babylon. So those are the kind of things I've done, and that's what the playbook continues. It's now in 200 companies.
You left a legacy then, obviously, tens of millions of pounds floating into the country in contracts as well, and beneficial health tech that's come into the UK as well. So some real impact, and again, after being thrown in the deep end.
I thank you for it because I did it because I thought I was doing the right thing, and then COVID hit. So I was there November 18, so just before the sale of Health IQ, for 4 years, pretty much dead on until end of 22. And so I got one good year of going around the world before COVID hit. Then I had COVID in the period after, and I'll give you an example. I went to something called HIMSS. HIMSS is the big global maturity for hospitals. They measure hospital maturity on a scale of 0 to 7, and 7 means you're world class. Like that's the pinnacle. Very few hospitals in the UK get to that level. And I went to HIMSS in the US, in Europe, and then in Asia Pacific. So it gave me a baseline of what digital maturity was in the world. And having that before COVID was a real education. But when COVID hit, I remember being asked by a Brazilian AI mental health chatbot company. So I'll repeat, they were AI mental health chatbot. And they said, we want to go to places that are not well served, maybe where there's high levels of deprivation. We were thinking Newcastle. And I said, no, West London. And they said to me, why West London? And I said, Grenfell. Now, right, when I say this in hindsight, it seems obvious. But imagine I hadn't told this company where to go based upon my own limited and biased view. They would have wasted lots of time trying to get into Liverpool and Newcastle, not got anywhere, not spoken to the right people, and given up on the market. And then told all their friends the UK is too hard to break. So that's another responsibility in and of itself. Is the company worth it for us? But also, how do I give them meaningful help? And that's really what I did for 4 years.
It becomes that pebble in the pond effect, and we all know, and this is why we both love, I guess, networking and being those bridges or APIs or whatever people want to call us, is because those fundamental connections and being such geeks in what we do, it means that you can point to the pebbles in the pond where you've seen that ripple in the pond and look for those overlaps where people can work together. So that's phenomenal, especially on such a global scale. And I guess that brought you to the end of that. You delivered huge, meaningful impact with that. What brought you back into the craziness of the life of a co-founder? Were you just sort of raring to get back to that ability to have more freedom and autonomy to go and look for and deliver solutions? Or was it just to get back into the startup ecosystem and help some others? Because obviously being exposed to a lot of tech in that time. So what was the key driver coming out of that sort of government environment into back into the entrepreneurial environment again?
On one level, I didn't have a choice because the government kept reducing the number of days I was doing. So I went from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 day a week.
whilst delivering outcomes.
Yeah. Um,
Great.
and
Sounds like a government decision. Sorry,
yeah, no comment. Um,
I'll say it. It's fucking idiocy. That's what that is. But carry on.
I left behind many good friends, but the other part was the playbook, which I had to fight tooth and nail to get done. Um, Eventually, was the reason why they said they didn't need me anymore. So the team, absolutely lovely people, were told, "Well, how about we don't need a specialist anymore, and what you do is you just maintain the playbook." So that's what's happened. I am now uh, leaving the role. That's what I was told, because the playbook has been successful. So I wrote my way out of the job, which in many ways was probably the right thing to do. Now I've stepped out. That was October 22, um, and I was part time. I've taken on two other roles. One of them is that I'm at UCL, which is one of the world's top 10 universities, and I'm at the Global Business School for Health, which is the world's first and only business school dedicated to healthcare. And I remember the director of the school came out to Saudi with me on a trade mission, and Nora, who is absolutely exceptional. She was part of Moorfields at the time. She watched what I was doing with the Saudis. So when she formed the school, she asked me to help and get involved. And her thank you to me is, would you like to be the module lead for startups on the Masters of Digital Health Entrepreneurship?
Cool.
So I said, that sounds great. And she said, and you'd be a visiting lecturer. And I said to her, so I'm an honorary at Imperial, where I used to teach real world evidence when I was back at Health IQ.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an honorary there. What's the difference between honorary and visiting? She said, we pay you. So I said, okay, great. Visiting it is. So I'm really lucky. I've spent a year. A good friend of mine, Dr. Masood Ahmed, the one who called me an onion whenever I
Yes.
was making a nick out of me on LinkedIn. He joined me as the co-module lead, and we taught the course. And I'm also now teaching on the MBA Health on contemporary issues and innovation. And UCL has now asked me to lead globally, going out with its custom exec education. So can I go and teach other people and build courses? I might not be the one doing all of the instruction on executive education for UCL. So that role is something that developed really by accident. It was a byproduct of me just trying to do a really good trade mission to Saudi. The other one is because there's something in the UK called Health Data Research UK, HDR UK. It's the National Institute for Health Data Science. And HDR UK is a public organization. It's been given money in UK research and investment and innovation. UKRI has been given money so that it can surface the data that we have, break the silos, connect everything, bring in industry, support patients, because our data is valuable in health data, but it's trapped. So HDR UK has that mission. And they have 9 hubs, and the cancer hub was looking for a commercial director. And they were asking around and they couldn't find anyone to take on the role because the other people were leaving. And they asked a friend of mine, and the friend of mine said, haven't you spoken to Hassan? They said, no, who's Hassan? And my friend said, he's had an exit with a real world evidence company, and he's just finished his 3-year non-compete, and he's in the UK government. And that's how I got the role that I'm currently in. I'm commercial director for HDR UK. Nobody on the healthcare side knew who I was because all of my time for 9 years as a founder was with pharma. I would speak to Roche, Novartis, Pfizer, AZ, GSK, but I wasn't known for being a real world evidence person on the healthcare side. Healthcare knows me as a digital health person. So I'm effectively, I've run a different career. My digital health career is a different career where I had to start from scratch, where I had to build new connections, I had to work out the landscape and just try and get to where I've got to. So I feel blessed to have had that government role in digital health, to lecture in digital health. I'm on the editorial board of the International Journal of Digital Health. I mentioned HIMSS. I'm one of the vice chairs for HIMSS UK and Ireland, and I mentor at 5 digital health startup accelerators.
As well as a few individual, around a dozen individual ones as well. I know. It's not really that bad for a guy who came out with a tutu and um, wasn't a doctor.
I'm a poster child for it's never too late. I think that's where I fit. Don't worry about not knowing what you want to do at the very beginning of your career. Are you somebody that is autodidactic? Can you learn by yourself? And I think there is a challenge where we're often forced to learn in a way that suits the teacher or the institution, but not the learner. And I've learned or had to learn lots of things that I have no background in. So I'll give you an example. At the hub that I'm at HDR UK, which is called DataCan, which is the cancer hub for HDR UK. So DataCan has a mission around multimodal data, which is simply data that comes from the electronic patient record is a mode, but then also the unstructured clinical notes is also a mode. And then the imaging, especially when it's digitized, is another. Then the pathology, which is really often in pathology, the question is it cancer? That's what you're doing the blood test for, right? Can you digitize the pathology? Then the molecular genetic profiling, the tissue blocks, each one of them are modes. Can we be multimodal? Can I work out the story of Chris and ask, what is it that we should be doing for you to maybe predict and preempt ill health using all of those modes? Now, to think about multimodal, we also have to think about something called longitudinal data that is cradle to grave. So I want to know what's happened to you 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago. I want to follow it so I can model what will happen 5 years' time. So when I talk about longitudinal and multimodal data, people ask me, so where did you do your master's in genetics or whatever it is that they ask,
Is
right?
that question cropping up again? Which PhD are you meant to have this time?
Yeah, and the answer is I have a tutu in politics. Right? I am somebody who I am enthusiastic because I can see, going back to when I mentioned about that gentleman with the incontinence pads in his home and going in knowing that I might get fleas, but knowing that I had no choice, that the responsibility that I had to that man and to his family was that I should go in and I should speak to him and I should burn my clothes later. That is what drives me, because I've seen how bad it can be. I've seen the gap between health and care. I've seen when staff burn out. I've seen the bullying. I remember when I was in that social work role, there were some people who were unqualified social workers. They gave them a name, care manager,
Mm-hmm.
and they were so worried when this woman was ill. She slept under the desk because she didn't want anyone to know that she wasn't well. The fear and the pressure that you get sometimes in these places when you're vulnerable. So I've seen the worst of it. That's what drives me. That's why I think the technology is so important, because we don't have the workforce. In fact, we don't even have the workforce to train the workforce we need.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't augment this with technology, we are screwed.
Right, important. Yes. No, that's and it's powerful
So let me let
because
me let me
yeah.
repeat
So
it quickly.
that
Right?
go on.
I'll repeat it quickly, right? I think that if we don't have the technology to augment our workforce, we're finished, because the workforce we have has so much pressure. The burden that it's dealing with is so large that it can't cope. We don't have the workforce. We don't have the workforce to train the workforce. We have to somehow change the pressure that we're under, and technology is the only way to stem the tide.
Agree, and it's the outcome led stuff, and it's not just the outcomes for for the patients is those people that they're actually delivering to make their life easier, to make things more efficient and reduce that burden, because the burden it isn't just on the patient or their families. The burden rests all the way along the line, and when you see the financial pressure, not just in an economy in like the UK where we have a free NHS, where the pressures are different, and the dynamics are different, but even in countries where there's paid healthcare right now, the amount of people I've seen that have put off healthcare diagnosis and all of these things, you're absolutely right in terms of being able to think from that perspective backwards, and then looking at those interaction points along the way from those people who could potentially intervene or help along the paths. It's phenomenal. So that's kind of led you to where you are now, and I think your new startup even helps connect those dots as well. So
One quick point, you've
go on.
touched on something really, really powerful, because you're right. It isn't just about the patient and the carer. It's also about the system and the healthcare professional, right? So we used to describe it as the triple aim, then the quadruple aim, now the quintuple aim. But the point about the five aims is that they all reinforce each other. So the first is often, can you improve the experience of care, the patient experience? But then can you improve the caregiver's experience of care? Can you reduce the per capita cost of care? Can you improve the outcomes for the population? And finally, can you reduce health inequalities or iniquity? And the reason why the quintuple aim is really powerful is because each of those five reinforce the other. There's no trade-off. But historically, we've discussed value-based healthcare, which is a trade-off, right? Quality is the outcome over the cost. So if you manage to reduce one, you improve the other. Now, for us, when we talk about quintuple aim, improving the quality of the interaction, if you like, the joy at work for the healthcare professional should improve the patient experience, which should improve the outcome, which should mean that they don't get ill again and come back in again, which reduces the costs, right? Can you see that it actually reinforces? So the quintuple aim is a really simple framework. It's very, very complex if you want to be, but it's a simple framework that tells me we need to help at different elements. And that's really where Vita, which is the agency that I now run, comes from. It's the idea that innovation is a team sport. So if all you do is focus on the innovator, the problem's going to be, it's not like retail. In retail, if I focus on the innovator, someone will buy. You might need to do some mum test and find out from people what they would buy and why they'd buy it. But healthcare is different. Healthcare, you need someone to adopt into a clinical workflow. And if they won't accept your clinical workflow change, they will never adopt your technology, regardless of what you say the outcome would be. So human factors is absolutely essential in what we do. Human factors, as an example, imagine that you give a surgeon a different kit and say, this is safer. But unfortunately, you're going home 2 hours later tonight. That's a human factor, right? And those are the problems in healthcare that often innovators don't think about. And it comes down to, and we've talked about being nerds. I'm a Heifetz nerd. So Professor Ronald Heifetz, years ago, he's a Harvard professor. He's been speaking for many years and written many books about adaptive learning and adaptive leadership. Very simply, and it's a complex theory, very simply, when the answer is clear because the problem is clear, they're both technical. When one of them requires learning, but the other is clear, it's technical and adaptive. But when you need learning to work out what the problem is and learning to work out what the solution is, it's both adaptive. And healthcare is both adaptive because sometimes we don't know what the problem is. And sometimes the solution needs learning in order to deploy it. It needs learning for us as innovators to put it in and us as healthcare professionals or non-healthcare professionals to adopt it. So because adaptive learning is the challenge, healthcare fails on digital transformation on a regular basis. It burns money. White elephant projects abound.
As somebody who's worked in the technology provision side of things in the past as well, that I can definitely vouch for a lot of money being wasted. As before I even go down the road of track and trace, that I probably could have got built completely for about £250,000. But and that's an example of what you're talking about in terms of actually starting with those outcomes and touch points in mind. If they'd worked that out and had those relationships with the actual innovators, the work on the ground and develop these things, then they probably would have spent no more than about £250,000 developing that solution, which would have been able to be rolled out across the UK with a team of 5 people to support it.
Yeah.
But that's where we think differently. So organisations like Beta are most definitely needed. And I mean, when it comes to health founders, health tech founders, and digital tech founders, digital health founders, sorry, that are starting out now, what would be the core piece of advice before they actually sort of go beyond that idea? What's the most common thing you pull people up on in those early stages?
So I'm really lucky that this is actually the content of the master's module that I lead for startups. And I've named it 5 laws, but I'll just focus on the first 3. The first is fall in love with the problem, not your solution. And I'll explain each one in turn. The second is follow the money. And the third is regulation, standards, evidence, all of those are not a tick box. So, very briefly, when someone goes in and says, I have this solution, buy this solution, it's a bit like the old interview trick of sell me this pen. I don't want your pen. I've got a job to do. Whether you're a nurse or a doctor or a commissioner or a departmental head or radiologist, I have a job to do. I don't care about your solution. What I care about is my problem. And if you can help me with my problem and you can prove to me that this pen solves that problem, I'll buy the pen. So the mistake often we find in digital health is people are pushing solutions, but they're not authentically, sincerely caring about the problem. And we are in the NHS quite sensitive to the idea that people are just trying to sell us things. It's not really what we want because there's a moral mission to the NHS. The second, when we say follow the money, just because you think it's a problem, and I agree with you, doesn't mean I can pay because of a very unusual fragmentation. The buyer in healthcare is often not the user, and the user is often not the beneficiary. So the organization that buys the product for the GP to use so it benefits the patient will say it's great, but no one else has benefited. And if there is a benefit, it's an indirect benefit where you can presume that patient won't come back and utilize a resource. But how do you model for that when the buyer, the user, the beneficiary is different? Whereas if you go to Burger King, the buyer, the user, and the beneficiary are usually the same thing. Even if what you're going to buy is a Happy Meal from McDonald's for your kids, you still benefit because the kids are going to be happy with you or quiet or whatever you want the outcome to be. In healthcare, the buyer, the user, beneficiary are all different. So you've got to follow the money. You need to make sure that you join them up and you need to make sure that each of them are connected in a way that means they champion for you. And the third, very simply, is in order to win, you need evidence. And because I was a real world evidence person for many years, and I've talked about human factors, if you can't prove the value of what you do, people won't buy it. But more than that, you should use it as a strategy. If you've done a clinical trial, that's a badge of honor. Don't treat it as a tick box. Promote it. Talk about being DCP 0129. I appreciate that's jargon for most, right? But say that you have a clinical safety officer
Yeah.
and named person ready to look after it. Use it as part of your outward promotion because it isn't just about ticking the box. Those are the 3 pieces of advice I'd give to those in digital health, health tech, med tech.
I'm a big believer in trust points, and Um, it's definitely something I've preached even outside of that digital healthcare arena. I come across digital health startups, but it's if you have those trust points, if you have ISO 9001 or 27001 or whatever, those kite marks matter. When somebody looks at something, it proves that you've taken the problem seriously enough to make sure that the solution is going to be robust enough, and secure enough for the customer to give a shit as well, and have confidence that you've got confidence and others have had confidence, just importantly. That's fantastic. And one question I always like to finish on before I throw it open to anyone else to ask any questions is, knowing the startup ecosystem as is right now, what do you like most of what's going on? And what do you like least and would like to see improve?
Okay, so in digital health, we're in maybe a third wave. Right, the first wave was primitive technology, really. Here's a wearable, maybe it's generic, and here's a dashboard, get on with it. And 10 years ago, that was cool and people invested in it. Now we're seeing deep technology, right? Proper deep tech, where someone is able to do a spit test, a saliva test, and tell you which of the three products that are available for you would work for your metabolism and your molecular genetic profile. We're moving into different fields, and that's really exciting. We are still in a phase where the science and the use case don't yet really match. So I'm not interested in the science if it doesn't meet the need. So I'm looking for products, looking for innovators who are solving a universal problem that people would pay for with the deep tech. And that's really what all of the investors are looking for right now. But there are some very interesting companies in that space. I'm supporting one right now called Newton's Tree, where the inventor of the AI deployment engine, AID, the world's only medical AI deployment engine, is spinning out from the London AI Centre based at St Thomas's Hospital, which is opposite Parliament. And this is a very long story about AI, but at the moment we're primitive in the sense that every medical AI application requires its own server, its own point-to-point integration, its own support. Whereas now with AID, almost like an iPhone, you can have 100 applications on one device. That's what he's invented. A hospital could go from having 3 or 4 deployments and be really painful to having 75 deployments of AI and transform everything. Now that's why I'm excited about what's going on in digital health. We are now in a space where it isn't just about looking cool, it's about deep tech that is genuinely cool. The thing that I dislike, and this goes back to conversations you and I have had before, is that lots of investors are still caught up by job titles. Oh, that person has this job title, they must be good. They're caught up in their own relationships, so you need a warm introduction to get to them, which reinforces inequality often when it comes to fundraising. And they don't see the market for what it really is. So there's lots of good tech that runs out of runway or doesn't get the funding in order to grow just because it can't persuade the investors. And Innovate UK and other funding that's available doesn't quite bridge the gap. And I think that is still a bit of an issue.
Yeah, I definitely completely agree on that one. And where those networks and that understanding doesn't exist. Part of the thing that forced Angels out in the first raft, I think around 2018, 2019, was they didn't understand AI and ML enough in the first place. As soon as they saw it on a pitch deck, they swallowed it and lost out. Thankfully, we're seeing more educated investors return now, which is fantastic. A lot of those are previous founders and current founder operators that are returning, but unfortunately, that takes time. And health digital health does take patient capital for those outcomes as well. But the domain expertise that exists within those founders, having met loads in the digital health space, is absolutely phenomenal. And as you say, a lot of them that are coming through now are use case led, which is the difference. So I think I definitely share your optimism around digital health because those founders and those people who are looking to make the change are so outcome led. And I'm so glad that I've seen less iPads in the last 6 or 7 years on the front lines of the NHS, where they were just thrust into people's hands and you got to use this now because this does this. So I think it's changing. I definitely think there's a cause for optimism. But do you think either Innovate UK and UK government or medical professionals themselves are probably at the top end or could do more themselves in terms of maybe helping to syndicate deals for earlier stage?
Spot on, prescient even. I can see more syndicates that are clinically driven, especially when you start to see groups of clinicians working together. There's a primary care accelerator that's now being formed. And as it's being formed, you've got 100 GPs who are all going to invest their own money into the technology that they want to see deployed. And because they put their money where their mouth is, they can then determine what the pilot should be, what the metric should be. They know what it means and they know the scaling, the initial part of the scaling can be done. And I think we're now going to start to see people with the skills and the interest coming together, going back to the buyer, user, beneficiary thing, where people say, well, I want to use it, I want to invest. So I think that's going to happen. I think that's going to force VC to be very careful around if they're generalist funds, do they have a venture partner who really understands healthcare? And if they understand healthcare, that's great, but do they understand medtech, which is a different field completely?
We know how many nuances there are within, absolutely.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And without that, I think we're going to still see the mismatch when it comes to capital. So I think there has to be more clinically driven investment, whether that's angels, syndicates of angels, or just people who are not really that sure they're angels, but they've got a bit of money to put in. How can they get into a syndicated fund? And people who are in the VC world moving a bit earlier, taking a bit more risk, and having more expertise. And unfortunately, VC is going the other way at the moment. It's saying, okay, we're a bit unsure about the market. We want more traction. So good things are getting funded, but not with the valuations that they had a few years ago.
and not within the things with the longer curve. So yeah, I get you. I think me and you need a separate, probably another conversation on that one, but we'll have that one. I think that co-pilot method makes more sense all round. Being able to build out maybe some of these syndicates and angel groups, even if they're not putting in big checks, but being able to verify some of this tech to say, look, we back this right now. People are tapped to go and put the money in, or we have, and this is as much as we can put into this. But we suggest you invest in this. Starts to maybe become a new kind of kite mark.
I like that. I also think there's going to be a rise of smart money. I think.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
So I was going to say smart money and distribution. What we're going to find is investors who are able to say, I can give you money and advice and support and connection and help you make your deal. And if we can get to that stage, that's when digital health companies will fly because often the network is close to them. They have a product, they don't know who to speak with. Can the investor unlock that?
Which gives a great chance of success and de-risks for all, which is what we're all after, isn't it? So
Yeah. De-risk.
De-risk. And that de-risks people from a health point of view when the stuff is implemented as well. So I think that may be the core word throughout all of that is de-risking for everyone in that 5-point value chain you spoke about earlier. So
If I could make a final comment, then I would
I may
say,
let Arthur throw a question in as well if you don't mind. I'm sure we'll have one.
yeah, I was just going to say one thing quickly,
Yeah.
which is that if we don't help citizens look after themselves, then we just won't survive. Really, the responsibility has to be with people to look after themselves and co-create. Technology has to play that role.
Absolutely. And oops. There you go. Hey, Arthur.
Hello. It sounds like, sorry, I had to go and deliver something, but then I managed to pop back because I did it quite quickly. Thank you so much, Hassan. That was absolutely fantastic. I think I said in my kind of comment that I'm based in the UK, but I work with a lot of kind of US based stuff. So it was very interesting to see the similarities with the challenges. You have absolutely answered my questions, and you got me really excited about the idea of specific syndicates of basically healthcare professionals. I've seen a little bit of it in New Zealand with people getting together, surgeons, to invest in tooling and that kind of thing, which makes so much sense. And that just seems like a very, very exciting opportunity, because that buy-in from the user, the healthcare professional, actually seems to be as important, if not more, than the patients, because the patients seem to grumble a lot if they're asked to do anything different. But especially in the UK, I'm not sure, do they ultimately do what they're given because there's no other option? Is that the general UK technology rollout as far as patients are, from the patient's view?
Yeah, thank you so much, Arthur. You're dead right. If there's no adoption clinically, then there's no chance of the adoption by the citizen, the patient, the carer. Often we still have a lot of trust in our physicians. So patients generally do commit to what they're told to. They might not stay on that for a long time, what we call adherence, persistence, concordance. They might not stay on long, but they generally do accept. But if you can't get the clinician in the first place and change the workflow, nothing changes.
That's why the idea of the clinician as an actual stakeholder in a venture is, yeah, pretty thrilling. I hope that either is being acted on or is soon, because I can really see surgeons and other healthcare professionals as potential angel investor syndicates.
Yeah, we're seeing more of it, and which is why I said Chris was prescient. I can see it starting to happen more and more. And as it's starting to happen, you're going to see more of those organizations saying, well, why don't we also deploy them in the practices or clinics that we have? Why don't we also get them onto procurement frameworks? Why don't we also introduce them to the National Institute for Health Research, the NIHR, where they can do their studies and get their regulation, and then they can become a class 2 medical device. Those are the kind of things that I think the clinical workflow has to have. If you don't have clinical buy-in, you won't change the workflow.
That's phenomenal and quite exciting. I'm seeing it happen in more general areas as well, with and as you said, alluded to earlier as well, it bodes well for more underrepresented founders, because many of the medical professionals are drawn across all walks of life and all ethnicities, and therefore there's going to be more empathy with underrepresented founders who are looking to change things with that domain expertise. So that to me is one of the huge wins as well.
You're so right. But when I think about founders, especially women or women of color, going to raise money, often from people who don't look anything like them, I've had the stories come back to me where they knew they were never going to get investment, but they were being pumped for information. How is it you do this, and how do you get in? And so when we find people going out, and it's a drain, a mental, emotional drain to raise money. You're selling in a way that is very deeply personal, because you're talking about your dreams and your hopes, and you're putting it on the line in the hope that there's a nibble. And I tell you what, it is a bit soul destroying for a lot of founders to go through all of that and be messed around. And I'm really glad to see women's founder office hours. I'm starting to see more and more of that happening. Credit where it's due. Lots of organizations have tried to do so, but the intersections are not well met, where you find people who are not just one thing. And that's where I find people who don't have the connections, who haven't got an MBA from London Business School. They haven't got all those relationships where, oh yeah, my dad is part of an angel syndicate, come join in. Those things are not open to them. And that's where it gets really difficult.
It is. And those barriers, I see being broken down, and I see things changing. Maybe not quick, well, definitely not quick enough. It'll never be quick enough for an impatient soul like me, and definitely not for the founders who actually need the money and the networks. But as you say, it's prescient that it's happening in digital health, and I'm seeing it happen more elsewhere. I think the more we see action behind that now, it's one thing to group these people together who say they're going to do it. I think stuff needs to happen, and the more that starts to happen, I think the more momentum will be built, and the more people will be on that journey. So, fingers crossed. Me and you'll be having a chat in a year's time, and there's a lot better outlook for underrepresented founders across the board, not just in digital health.
You're so right. So I'm a free school meals kid, single parent family from a part of East London, rough enough that I would say you probably shouldn't visit, right? So that's me, right? Comes from a deeply conservative, in a small C, religious immigrant family, right? So I am an unusual person to be sent to other countries by the British government. I remember I went with a colleague civil servant, Indian, and no one believed we were British government. Like I'm used to being underestimated, very much so. I was underestimated by people who thought, well, I was just a government guy, not realizing that I had bootstrapped a startup to international expansion and sold it. People underestimate all of us all the time. So I think you do develop a thick skin, you do develop a resilience, but it only really works when you have a network of other people that you can go to, that you can rest with, that you don't have to fight against and rub up against. Diversity X, it's a wonderful community, wonderful people.
Brilliant.
And with what you're doing and how you work to make sure that people like me have a support network, credit to you, genuinely.
Yeah, I guess it comes from my own hate of inequity, coming from. I grew up in a Thatcherite.
She took your milk.
Yeah, the bitch. I think it was. I think it was more just changing the landscape at a stroke across swathes of the country, and those areas of the country weren't affluent to begin with, and removing livelihoods with nothing to replace it or no thought in advance of how to replace it, and I saw families destroyed by that. So
Yeah,
I guess that set off my hate of inequity, and it's been there ever since. So seeing that in the funding landscape where I'm a geek and I have some domain knowledge means there is something I can impact. And even though it's not a lived experience, in terms of either being female or founded with different ethnic origins, I've seen it firsthand. I've heard the anecdotal evidence. I've seen everything else that goes on, and it's something that I want to change. So, yeah, I'm glad people like you are on the same mission again, Hassan. So, yeah, I think the more we fight with each other, shoulder by shoulder, the more we'll get done. So, it takes a village to raise a child.
I think there will be a lot of changes coming, and I think people that come after us will benefit from what we've gone through now. So I think a large part of my own mission is how can I support other founders? I actually don't consider myself to be in the same game that I was when I was a founder before exit. Even though I have an agency, I view myself as supporting other founders. So I'm a NED and I'm an advisor, and I run an agency with friends, which is offering effectively consulting services for founders. So technically I'm a founder, But I think I'm now almost semi-retired from the founder journey, because it takes tremendous willpower. But when I find a founder who has that willpower, and I join in, and I'm like number three on, number three, number four, somewhere in the team, I think that's what gives me the energy.
It's always a relay, and the team you start with is never the team you scale with. So those people are always appreciated along that journey. And having the brains outside the business, particularly for those people who don't necessarily have the networks, is huge. It's huge. I've been grateful for the help I've had from so many people along this journey, so you included. So yeah, it's been phenomenal. I know we've gone over. Kind of knew we would. We'd always have a lot to talk about. But huge nuggets in there as well. And what a fantastic journey. And I definitely think your mother would be proud of you, and you too.
If I was to say to my mother that I was a postdoc, equivalent to a postdoc in 2016, because I have an honorary research position at Imperial, that still doesn't quite make
Cut
as
it.
much sense as, yeah, do you see what I mean? It's not the same. It's not the same at all. I don't have an MBA. I teach on the MBA, right? I don't have a master's. I'm a module lead on a master's. I don't have a PhD, but I'm a postdoc. In all those ways, I feel like I may have done better than expected, right? Considering where I began. But I will always have that over me. I'm not a doctor. That's always going to be there.
No. I think you've proved you don't need to be.
Well, the Malaysians still call me Dr. Hassan, so there's something.
In at least one country, you're a doctor. That's enough. So, no, as somebody who's also mentally a restless soul that delves into every subject and learns it inside out, I completely sympathise. And I think there's the outpouring of support that was on that LinkedIn post the other day, I think proves that there's a ton of people who are proud and appreciative of your help, Hassan. So thanks for appearing on the podcast today. And yeah, we'll make sure that this recording goes live on Friday as well. And I'll see if I can tag in all those people who are supportive of the podcast the other day, so they can watch back. And then we'll edit out some snippets as well, so we can drop some of those brilliant sound bites and advice into smaller bits too.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate you, man.
Cheers, dude.
Thank you.